What is the research behind brain-based therapies for reading? I'm Dr. Emily Sherwood. For more information about literacy, please like and subscribe. So Sherry was in tears when she was talking to Louisa, a reading specialist, about her son, Jeb. Jeb was 7 years old and he struggled to read, and he had been struggling since kindergarten. Now, when Sherry brought it up to the teachers, they just said that he was struggling to read and they really didn't know what to do. They did put him in an intervention group. His school did have intervention, but it wasn't doing a whole lot. They were just teaching him more phonics skills and doing very little reading, and he wasn't really getting anywhere. So she went to her pediatrician. Pediatrician sent her to a specialized occupational therapist, and this was supposed to be the best person in the state. It was an hour and a half away. Sherry was a working mom. She had an older child in high school, and she was doing things with that child, teaching the child how to drive and to do all these different things. And she wasn't able to spend time with that child because weekly she would have to make these trips. She also had to take time off of work unpaid because here in the United States we have very few vacation hours or sick leave. And so she would be having to drive and spend one full day. As occupational therapist, she also had to take Jeb out of school. He was missing a lot of school to see this person, but this person was considered the best in the state. Considered really, just miracle worker with children. Had the latest technology, the latest research behind him. And so this occupational therapist weekly would have Jeb do things that seemed kind of bizarre and strange to Sherry. For example, he would have to practice his fine motor skills, like crumple up a piece of paper and then open it up. He would have to track objects with a light with his eyes. That was supposed to help with reading. And he also did things like that were supposed to train his eyes to cross the midline, because the occupational therapist said that his eyes were not focused. So this whole idea was based on retraining the brain and retraining his eyes. And the doctor also told Sherry that this problem was related to drug use during pregnancy, and that really bothered Sherry because she did not use drugs and ever, and she was just really taken aback and upset, was really offended by this idea that the doctor thought that she had used drugs during pregnancy, and the doctor kept on bringing that up and kind of condescending towards her, like just put her down as a parent, kind of gaslit her. And Jeb didn't make progress. After about 6 months, Sherry stopped it because this is just a lot of work. It's hard, taking time off of work, going to the specialist who doesn't seem to be doing anything, who has a very negative opinion about the family. Jeb is missing a lot of school. There's also a cost involved. It was covered by insurance, but not the entire cost, because if you live in the United States, you know that health care of any kind is expensive. So it was costing a lot of money, several $100s a month, not to mention the gas, the food, everything that she had to do, the time off of work to get there and to have this services. So Sherry then turned to Louisa, who was working at a university reading clinic, the director of a university reading clinic right in their town. And she was able to get Jeb tutoring sessions after school. He didn't have to miss school, and it was very low cost. It was basically a service to the community. And he started to do better, and within about a year, he was out of intervention, and he was just about caught up to grade level. And I tell this story because I've heard a lot of stories about children, especially recently, who are part of what we call brain-based therapies. And it's this idea that there's something wrong with the brain, and if you can't read, you must have something wrong with your brain. It's a very medical model. The idea that something is defective in a child's brain, that the child did not learn the brain skills, or the child's brain did not fully develop in some way, and that's what's causing the problem. And I've heard about all kinds of things. I've heard about using MRIs to diagnose dyslexia. I've heard about occupational therapist, behavior therapy, all kinds of things that have to do with this idea of treating reading. But what's the research behind this? So the short answer is there's not good research behind brain-based therapies for reading. There is some evidence that struggling readers in some cases have differences in their brain. For example, there's some evidence that that people who struggle to read in some cases use the right brain hemisphere instead of the left, or they don't use both hemispheres the way that most people do. In other words, parts of the brain are not activated as much. That there have been MRIs and studies of people who are diagnosed with dyslexia who struggle to read, and they found that the nerve cells sometimes are not as activated. That's been shown in some cases. Again, not with everyone, but that's more the diagnosis side, and it's very much in its infancy. There's still a lot of research that has to be done before that's even proven, or there's even good evidence that happens. And we know that MRIs in the United States are very, very expensive. It's really not practical to eventually go the medical route where every child who has a reading problem gets diagnosed using medical technology, because it's just very expensive. MRIs are in short supply, and CT scans and things like that look at the brain. And studies have shown that this is not true with everyone who struggles to read, because not everyone who struggles with read has an organic problem. In fact, research shows that most people probably don't have an organic problem who struggle to read. There's this idea out there that every reading problem, again, is a learning disability, that's something wrong with the child's brain, and they blame the child that is struggling to read. And again, there are lots of reasons why a child might struggle to read, and a lot of it's instructional. The child may just not get the instruction they need, and that doesn't mean that child does not have teachers who are dedicated. It doesn't mean necessarily that the school is just filled with awful people who don't care. It means that for whatever reason, that child did not get what they needed. And many times those are systemic problems. We have schools that are not set up for what many children need, especially children who may come from maybe a little bit of a different background. And so there's lots of reasons why people can't read well. And again, research shows that 95 to 97 people can learn to read on grade level with the right intervention. But there's absolutely no evidence that these brain-based therapies, these kind of bizarre things, that they help with reading. There's some evidence in its infancy, very, very beginning stages of looking at a brain, of how the brain works and how it might affect learning in general, particularly they teach you things like executive function and an organization of the brain, getting the brain to work better. But that's very much in its infancy as well. There's just not good research at this point. But this is still a very popular thing. And historically, this has been a popular thing. So the idea of brain-based training for reading actually started in the 1940s. There was this idea that reading problems were because of brain damage and damage to the nervous system. But at that time, it was more what we might call ADHD, which of course has been medicalized in this country. Attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. Many children are diagnosed with that by a doctor. So that was kind of the whole beginning of this whole idea of the medical model of learning and of disability and problems with reading and problems with learning. And then later they called it minimal brain dysregulation, and eventually it became learning disabled, or in the United States you sometimes hear LD, and then lately you hear specific learning disabled, which is actually the term that's used to identify children with learning disabilities, and it's sometimes called SLD now. And it was really hard for me to find information about these beginning therapies that they tried, but it was very difficult for me to find a lot of information about these beginning therapies because most of it was behind a paywall, because there are things in the scholarly literature, but it's very difficult to find that without subscription services to some of these journals that I did not have access to. So, but what I did find was that there was this idea of psychomotor patterning, and that was the idea of rewiring the brain. So does this sound familiar, the idea that there's something wrong with the brain and you have to rewire it? This was big in the 1960s. And there was this idea that basically the brain did not neurologically develop correctly. And there were these stages that children had to go through with brain development, and at some point the stages they didn't develop correctly, according to this theory. And so the idea was that you were going to create patterns in the nervous system to kind of get your brain up to speed. And there were things like sensory work. They had children crawl on the floor. They did breathing exercises because there was this idea that the brain needed more oxygen. All these different things that were tried with this whole patterning idea. And by 1982, they realized that this was just not working, that this was not correct, and they stopped this largely. However, the whole program kept going, and actually in 1996, it was on the Kathy Lee Gifford show, this idea of patterning, and this research center that was doing that. So there's still, even though it's been disproven, there's still this idea out there in the conscious that this is a thing. And now this group that was doing the repatterning is into things like food sensitivities, which is a new trend that children can't learn because of food sensitivities. And again, there may be a small number of children who have this problem, and that may influence their learning. There's a small bit of truth in all of this. But generally speaking, these brain-based therapies don't work. And there's very little evidence behind them for reading. And again, there has been some very small studies, particularly with people who have specific brain-based disorders, particularly people who have things like epilepsy, who have had brain cancer and things like that do show some low level of effectiveness with things that train the brain. But again, this is in its infancy, and it doesn't apply to the average student. It's just people in various kind of unique situations, like severe epilepsy or something like that. And what we do know from studies, what there is evidence for, is that it's the opposite. Not that rewiring the brain will lead to better reading, but that reading leads to rewiring the brain. So we know that when students read, that their brain actually develops neurons. And so if the brain is having some kind of difficulty, what we might call dyslexia, or just struggling to read in general, even if there's an environmental cause, which there often are, like the student just hasn't had exposure to reading, that brain will improve. And the brain starts getting better over time with reading. This has been proven with MRIs. And it's well known. So if you're a parent out there and you have a child who's struggling to read, I suggest you don't do these brain-based therapies that have very little research or no research behind them, but that you work on your child's brain doing what we know works with this reading. And that's the good news. Something as simple as reading, and reading often, can actually help the brain and help the brain to improve. And become a better reader. And when we talk about fluency, which is the idea of reading automatically and correctly, we know that reading a lot will help the brain to become more automatic, to recognize words, and to do better. And this goes with this idea that we know that that the brain will get better from reading. So, again, instructional support and instruction for the reading instruction, and then just reading in general will help the brain more than crawling on the floor or tracking with your eyes. Those are things that have not been proven, and oftentimes are kind of take advantage of people. Because oftentimes insurance will pay for anything that's labeled a therapy. Whereas with reading instruction, most of the time that's not paid for. So again, this is a byproduct of our ultra-capitalist system, and in my opinion, not a very fair one, that children and families are being taken advantage of. These are families that are in pain. These are families just looking for any kind of an answer, and they're promised answers of this. But as of right now, the research just isn't there. There's just very little research behind brain-based therapies. So I want to hear from you. Have you experienced brain-based therapies, or do you know anyone who has? What has your experience been? What were you told? Did you do a brain-based therapy for something other than reading? Because, as I said, there is a very small body of evidence that shows that for some cases it can be helpful with things other than reading. I would love to hear from you. So please comment in the chat. Please let me know what you think. And until next time, keep learning.